The wrench slipped from Marcus's oil-stained fingers as his supervisor's voice boomed across the garage. "This is your fault. The entire engine block is ruined because you didn't follow procedure." 23 years old, Marcus stood frozen as every mechanic in the shop turned to stare. His hands shook as he looked at the destroyed Mercedes engine, work he'd never even touched. But Frank Morrison, the shop supervisor, pointed directly at him, his face red with manufactured rage. "You cost us $12,000, kid. Pack your tools." The other mechanics looked away, avoiding eye contact. Marcus had worked here for 3 years, building engines with precision, earning respect inch by inch. Now in one moment, it was all crumbling. But what Frank didn't know was that Marcus had been keeping detailed records of every job. And tonight he would finally, what country are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and if these stories inspire you, feel free to subscribe. Marcus Rivera had always believed that hard work and honesty would be enough. Growing up in a cramped apartment above his grandmother's bakery, he'd watched her knead dough before dawn every morning, her weathered hands moving with practiced grace. "Mijo," she'd whisper as he helped her carry flour sacks. "When you find your calling, you hold on to it with both hands, no matter what." At 19, Marcus found his calling under the hood of a 1987 Camaro that refused to start. Something about the way metal pieces fit together, the logic of combustion and compression, spoke to him in a language he understood. He enrolled in technical school, working nights at a gas station to pay tuition, his fingers permanently stained with motor oil and ambition. Precision Motors had hired him straight out of tech school. The garage smelled of metal shavings and possibility, and Marcus breathed it in like incense. Frank Morrison, the shop supervisor, had seemed impressed during the interview. "We need young blood," he'd said, shaking Marcus's hand with a grip that felt like approval. "Someone who understands these new computerized systems." For 3 years, Marcus had poured himself into every engine that crossed his workbench. He arrived early, stayed late, and treated each repair like a puzzle that deserved solving. The other mechanics, Tom, Eddie, Carlos, had slowly accepted him into their circle, sharing coffee from the perpetually burning pot and teaching him shortcuts their fathers had taught them. But something had always felt off about Frank. It started with small things: invoices that didn't match the work performed, parts orders that exceeded what jobs required. Frank would handle certain customers personally, steering them away from the main work floor. When Marcus asked about it, Frank's smile would turn cold. "Stick to turning wrenches, kid. Let me handle the business side." Marcus tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. He focused on his work, on the satisfaction of hearing an engine purr back to life. But the feeling grew stronger when Mrs. Chen brought in her Honda Civic for a simple oil change, and Frank charged her for a complete brake overhaul she didn't need. Marcus had watched Frank's hands shake slightly as he wrote up the invoice, and something protective stirred in his chest. That's when Marcus started keeping his notebook. It was nothing fancy, just a small black composition book he'd bought at the dollar store. But every day he recorded details: which cars came in, what work was actually performed, what was charged. At first it was just curiosity, a way to understand the business better. But as weeks turned to months, patterns emerged that made his blood run cold. Frank was systematically overcharging customers, particularly elderly clients and single women who didn't know enough about cars to question the work. He was ordering expensive parts and billing them to jobs that only needed minor repairs, then selling the unused parts privately. Most disturbing of all, he was having Marcus and the other mechanics perform unnecessary work, then splitting the profits with a few complicit customers who would later return the defective parts for cash refunds. The weight of what he was discovering pressed down on Marcus's shoulders like a lead blanket. His grandmother had always taught him that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of wrongdoing. But speaking up meant risking everything: his job, his career, his future. The decision was made for him on a gray Tuesday morning in November. Frank had been more agitated than usual, pacing the shop floor and barking orders. A shipment of high-end Mercedes parts had arrived that morning. Components for a complete engine rebuild that should have taken weeks to complete. But Frank wanted it done in 3 days, working around the clock. "This customer pays well," Frank had explained to the crew, his eyes darting between them. "We do this right, there's a bonus for everyone." Marcus threw himself into the work, staying until nearly midnight each night. The engine was a masterpiece of German engineering, and rebuilding it required every skill he'd learned. By Thursday evening, it was nearly complete. Pistons aligned, timing perfect, every component calibrated to factory specifications. But when Marcus arrived Friday morning, the engine was destroyed. Not just damaged, destroyed. Pistons cracked, cylinder walls scored, timing chains snapped. It looked like someone had run it without oil, or worse, had deliberately sabotaged it. Marcus stared at the wreckage, his mouth dry with shock. 12 hours of meticulous work ruined overnight. That's when Frank appeared, his face a mask of fury that seemed too polished, too rehearsed. "This is your fault. The entire engine block is ruined because you didn't follow procedure." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around the shop, conversation stopped. Tools paused mid-motion. Every eye turned toward them, and Marcus felt heat creep up his neck. "Frank, I followed every specification. I triple-checked the torque settings, verified the timing." "Don't lie to me." Frank's voice carried across the concrete floor. "You cost us $12,000, kid. Pack your tools." The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus looked around at his colleagues. Tom avoiding his gaze, Eddie studying his hands, Carlos shaking his head in disappointment. 3 years of building relationships, earning respect, proving himself, and it evaporated in an instant. But as Marcus walked to his toolbox on unsteady legs, something crystallized in his mind. The engine hadn't been destroyed by accident or negligence. The damage was too precise, too complete. Someone had sabotaged it deliberately. And Frank's performance, because that's what it was, a performance, was too smooth, too practiced. This wasn't the first time. Marcus's hands found the small black notebook tucked beneath his wrenches. 3 years of careful documentation. 3 years of watching Frank exploit trusting customers and manipulate his crew. 3 years of staying silent while injustice flourished in plain sight. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. "When you find your calling, you hold on to it with both hands, no matter what." His calling wasn't just fixing engines. It was fixing what was broken, even when that meant standing alone against someone with power. That night, Marcus sat at his small kitchen table under the yellow glow of a second-hand lamp, spreading 3 years of records across the surface. Invoice copies, work orders, parts receipts, customer conversations he'd overheard and documented. Page after page of careful handwriting that told a story of systematic fraud. But evidence meant nothing without someone willing to listen. Marcus thought about going to the police, but fraud investigations took time, and meanwhile Frank would continue victimizing customers. He considered contacting the Better Business Bureau, but bureaucratic processes moved slowly while harm continued. Then he remembered something. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman Frank had overcharged for unnecessary brake work, had mentioned her son during her visits. "He works for Channel 7, she'd said proudly. Investigative reporting. Always trying to help people who can't help themselves. Finding David Chen's contact information took 3 hours of internet searching. Writing the email took longer. How do you summarize 3 years of documented fraud in a way that sounds credible rather than vindictive? Marcus rewrote it 7 times, his grandmother's words guiding each revision. Stick to facts, let the truth speak for itself. The response came faster than expected. David Chen wanted to meet. They agreed on a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where Marcus wouldn't be recognized. David was younger than Marcus had expected, maybe 30, with alert eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a handshake that conveyed both strength and trustworthiness. "My mother mentioned you," David said as they settled into a corner booth. "She said you always treated her car like it belonged to your own family." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Your mother's a good person. She didn't deserve what Frank did to her." David leaned forward. "Tell me everything." For 2 hours, Marcus walked David through his documentation. Invoice discrepancies, unnecessary repairs charged to trusting customers, parts fraud, the pattern of targeting vulnerable clients. David took notes, asked clarifying questions, and studied each piece of evidence with the intensity of someone who understood that details mattered. "This is extensive," David said finally, "but I need more than documents. I need testimony from victims, preferably on camera. And I need proof of current fraud, not just historical patterns." Marcus's heart sank. "Most of the customers don't even know they were cheated, and I don't work there anymore, so I can't document current fraud." "Actually," David smiled for the first time, "that termination might be our advantage. Frank probably thinks you're neutralized as a threat. He won't be expecting what comes next." What came next was the most terrifying week of Marcus's life. David had connections, investigators, legal experts, former fraud victims willing to share their stories. But the plan required Marcus to do something that went against every instinct. He had to apply for his job back. "Frank will be suspicious," David warned. "But if he believes you're desperate and defeated, he might let his guard down." We need current evidence of fraud, and you're the only one positioned to get it. Marcus spent 3 days crafting his approach. He would play the part of a desperate young mechanic who'd learned his lesson, who needed the job too badly to cause trouble. It felt like swallowing poison, but his grandmother's voice whispered courage. Sometimes doing right requires doing what's hard. Frank's office smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. Behind his desk, Frank leaned back in his chair like a king granting audience to a peasant. The performance began before Marcus even sat down. Well, the prodigal mechanic returns. Frank's smile had the warmth of a snake's belly. Learn your lesson, did you? Marcus forced his shoulders to slump, his voice to crack slightly. I need this job, Frank. I can't find work anywhere else. Word gets around in this business. I know I messed up, but I'll do better. I'll follow every procedure exactly. Frank studied him for a long moment, and Marcus felt like a specimen under a microscope. You cost me money, kid. Big money. Customers sued us over that engine. I'll work extra hours. Take a pay cut. Whatever it takes. The silence stretched until Marcus's palms grew damp. Then Frank leaned forward, his smile widening into something predatory. Maybe we can work something out. But things are going to be different now. You follow my lead on everything. Every invoice, every work order, every customer interaction goes through me. You're not paid to think anymore, just to do what you're told. Understood? Marcus nodded, tasting bile. Understood? Good. Frank pulled out a work order. There's a lady coming in this afternoon. Older woman, drives a Buick. She needs new brake pads. Simple job, maybe 2 hours. But she's going to pay for a complete brake system overhaul. New rotors, calipers, the works. You're going to install the brake pads and nothing else. But you're going to tell her we did the full job. Got it. There it was. Current fraud, explicit instructions. Frank's own words condemning him. Marcus felt the weight of the recording device David had given him, hidden in his shirt pocket like a tiny anchor. Got it, Marcus said. For 5 days, Marcus documented Frank's operation from the inside. Each fraudulent work order, each manipulated invoice, each elderly customer charged for repairs they didn't need. The recording device captured Frank's explicit instructions, his casual dismissal of ethics, his complete lack of remorse for the people he was cheating. But the hardest part wasn't the evidence gathering. It was watching the victims. Mrs. Patterson, whose fixed income barely covered her medications, paying $800 for transmission work her car didn't need. Mr. Rodriguez, a recent widower who relied on his late wife's car to visit her grave, charged for an engine rebuild that was completely unnecessary. Young parents like Sarah and Mike, stretching their budget to keep their minivan running, unknowingly paying twice what their repair should have cost. Each face etched itself into Marcus's memory. Each transaction a small tragedy enabled by his silence. The weight of complicity pressed down on him until he could barely sleep. But David's words echoed like a mantra. Sometimes you have to let injustice continue briefly in order to stop it permanently. The breaking point came on the 5th day. Frank had scheduled a special customer for Friday afternoon, someone who needed major engine work and would pay premium prices. When the car arrived, Marcus's blood turned to ice water. It was his grandmother's 1998 Honda Civic. Abuela climbed out slowly, her arthritic hands gripping the doorframe for support. At 82, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had carried her through decades of hard labor. She'd called Marcus that morning, worried about strange noises the car was making, asking if he knew a trustworthy mechanic. Frank appeared beside the car like a vulture spotting carrion. Mrs. Rivera, Marcus told me you might be coming by. Don't worry, we'll take excellent care of you. Marcus felt his world tilt sideways. Frank hadn't known about the family connection when he'd planned this fraud, but now that knowledge gleamed in his eyes like a weapon. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal. Mijo, his grandmother said, surprised to see him. You didn't tell me you worked here. I dot. Marcus's voice caught. Across the garage, Frank watched with predatory interest, waiting to see how Marcus would handle this test of loyalty. Don't worry, Mrs. Rivera, Frank interrupted smoothly. Marcus here is going to personally handle your car. We'll have it running like new. The work order Frank handed Marcus later made his hands shake with rage. The Honda needed a simple alternator replacement, maybe $200 in parts and 2 hours of labor. But Frank had written up a complete engine overhaul. New pistons, timing belt, water pump, transmission service, brake system replacement. Total cost, $4,800. Nearly half of his grandmother's monthly Social Security income. That evening, Marcus sat in his car outside Precision Motors until the parking lot emptied. The recording device felt heavy in his pocket. 5 days of evidence that could destroy Frank's operation. But using it meant admitting his own complicity in the fraud, accepting responsibility for every customer he'd watched get cheated while gathering proof. His phone buzzed with a text from David. "How did it go today? We're almost ready to move." Marcus stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back, "It's time." The next morning arrived gray and cold. November wind rattling the garage's metal walls like chains. Marcus arrived early, his stomach knotted with anticipation and dread. By 8 a.m., the shop was humming with its usual rhythm. Air compressors sighing, impact wrenches chattering, the radio playing classic rock nobody really listened to. At exactly 9:15, David Chen walked through the front door with a camera crew. Frank's face went through a fascinating series of transformations. Confusion, recognition, anger, and finally calculation. He straightened his shoulders and forced a professional smile, the mask of respectability sliding into place with practiced ease. "Good morning," David said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to asking hard questions. "I'm David Chen from Channel 7 Investigative Reports. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your business practices." "I'm not sure what you mean," Frank replied, but his eyes were already scanning for exits. "We run a legitimate auto repair shop here." "Do you?" David pulled out a tablet, swiping to the first piece of evidence. "We have documentation of systematic fraud spanning 3 years, unnecessary repairs charged to elderly customers, parts fraud, invoice manipulation. Would you care to comment?" The garage had gone completely silent. Every mechanic stood frozen, tools suspended mid-motion, all pretense of work abandoned. Marcus felt their eyes on him, understanding dawning in their faces as they realized who had provided the evidence. Frank's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "I don't know what you're talking about. If you don't have a car that needs repair, I'll have to ask you to leave." "Actually, we do have a car that needs repair." David gestured toward the parking lot. "Mrs. Rivera's Honda Civic. Your shop diagnosed it as needing $4,800 in work. But according to 3 independent mechanics we consulted, it needs a $200 alternator replacement. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Frank's eyes found Marcus across the garage, and the look that passed between them was pure poison. "That diagnosis was performed by one of our mechanics. If there was an error, it was his mistake, not company policy." "Actually," David smiled, "we have recorded evidence suggesting otherwise." The recording played on speakers David's crew had set up, Frank's voice filling the garage with crystal clarity. "You're going to install the brake pads and nothing else, but you're going to tell her we did the full job." "Got it." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank's face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. Around the garage, Marcus's colleagues stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to betrayal. "That recording is illegal," Frank sputtered. "Taken without consent. Actually, it's perfectly legal under state law." David interrupted. "Single-party consent?" The person making the recording was a participant in the conversation. Frank's eyes swept the garage again, landing on each mechanic in turn, looking for allies or at least neutral parties. But Tom was shaking his head in disgust. Eddie had set down his tools and was walking toward the door. Carlos was staring at Frank like he'd never seen him before. "Furthermore," David continued, "we have testimony from 17 victims of your fraud going back 3 years. Mrs. Patterson, who paid $800 for unnecessary transmission work. Mr. Rodriguez charged for an engine rebuild his car didn't need. The Hendersons, who paid twice what their brake repair should have cost. Would you like to hear their statements?" "This is harassment," Frank said, but his voice had lost its authority. "You can't just come in here with cameras." "We're not just here with cameras," David said quietly. "We're here with investigators from the State Attorney General's office." As if summoned by his words, 2 people in suits appeared in the doorway. A man and woman with badges and expressions that brooked no argument. Behind them came uniformed police officers. "Frank Morrison," the female investigator said, stepping forward, "you're under arrest for fraud, consumer deception, and theft by deception." The next few minutes passed in a blur of chaos. Frank shouting about lawyers and lawsuits, police officers securing evidence. The other mechanics standing in stunned silence as their supervisor was led away in handcuffs. But through it all, Marcus felt something unexpected. Not triumph, but profound sadness. 3 years of his life wasted in a place built on lies. Colleagues who might never trust him again. A career that would forever be marked by this moment. David approached him as the chaos settled. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. 17 families got justice because you had the courage to speak up. Marcus nodded, but the words felt hollow. Around the garage, his colleagues were avoiding eye contact, gathering their tools, preparing to leave. The recording had made him a hero to the victims, but to his co-workers, he was something else entirely. The one who brought down their workplace, their income, their security. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now," David smiled, "now you rebuild. Just like you've been doing with engines your whole life." The garage closed the following week. Without Frank's fraudulent income, Precision Motors couldn't meet its debts. The building stood empty, tool marks still visible on workbenches, coffee stains permanent on concrete floors where honest mechanics had shared morning conversations. Marcus found himself unemployed again, but this time the circumstances were different. Word of his whistleblowing had spread through the automotive community like ripples from a stone thrown in still water. Some shop owners saw him as a troublemaker, someone who couldn't be trusted to keep business secrets. But others saw something different: integrity, attention to detail, the courage to do what was right even when it cost him everything. The call came from Elena Rodriguez on a Tuesday morning in December. "Mr. Rivera? This is Elena Rodriguez from Rodriguez & Sons Auto Repair. I heard about what you did at Precision Motors." Marcus braced himself for another rejection. "Yes, ma'am. My father built this business on trust. 40 years of treating customers like family, of doing honest work for fair prices. We've been looking for someone who shares those values." She paused. "Would you be interested in an interview?" Rodriguez & Sons occupied a converted warehouse on the south side of town, sunlight streaming through skylights onto work bays where 3 generations of mechanics had learned their trade. Elena's father, Miguel, was 75 but still moved around engines with the grace of a dancer, his weathered hands gentle on delicate components. "I know your grandmother," Miguel said during the interview, his English accented but clear. "She makes the best conchas in the city. A woman like that doesn't raise a dishonest grandson." The job paid less than Precision Motors, but it came with something Marcus had never experienced: complete trust. Elena handled the business side, Miguel supervised the complex repairs, and Marcus was given freedom to work at his own pace, to take pride in every job, to treat each customer's car like it belonged to his own family. More importantly, he found himself part of a team that shared his values. Rosa, Miguel's daughter-in-law, specialized in electrical systems and taught Marcus diagnostic techniques he'd never learned. Jimmy, Miguel's grandson, was fresh out of tech school but possessed an intuitive understanding of modern computer systems. Together, they created an environment where excellence wasn't just expected, it was natural. The first time Mrs. Chen brought her Honda in for service, Marcus felt his chest tighten with anxiety. But her smile was warm, genuine, free of the wariness he'd expected. "I heard about what you did," she said quietly as he looked under her hood. "My son told me. You saved a lot of people from being cheated." "I should have spoken up sooner," Marcus replied, checking her oil level. "Maybe. But you spoke up when it mattered most. That takes courage." The repair was simple: a worn serpentine belt that needed replacing. Marcus showed Mrs. Chen the old belt, explained why it needed to be changed, and charged her exactly what the work was worth. No hidden fees, no unnecessary add-ons, no exploitation of trust. As she drove away, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: professional satisfaction uncontaminated by guilt. Christmas Eve found him working late at Rodriguez & Sons, finishing a restoration project for a customer who wanted to surprise his wife with her father's restored 1967 Mustang. The engine was a masterpiece. Marcus had rebuilt it from the ground up, each component cleaned, measured, and fitted with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. As he torqued the final head bolt, his phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. "Channel 7's year-end investigative report airs tonight. Thought you'd want to know. Frank got 5 years, and the state recovered over $200,000 in restitution for victims." Marcus set down his wrench and walked outside into the cold December air. The city sparkled beyond the industrial district, Christmas lights twinkling in windows, families gathering for celebrations built on love and trust and shared traditions. 5 years. It seemed both too much and too little for the harm Frank had caused. But justice wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about restoration, about making things right for the people who had been wronged. His phone rang. His grandmother's voice, warm and loving, filled the silence. "Mijo, are you working late again?" "Just finishing up, Abuela. The Mustang is ready." "The good. Come home." I made tamales, and your cousin Sophia is here with the babies. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Drive safe. And Marcus? Yes, I'm proud of you. Your grandfather would be proud too. After she hung up, Marcus stood in the cold air for another moment, letting her words settle in his chest like warmth. Proud, not because he'd exposed corruption or made headlines or received recognition. Proud because he'd chosen to do right when doing right was hard. The Mustang's engine turned over on the first try, 8 cylinders firing in perfect sequence, exhaust note pure and strong. Marcus listened to it idle for a moment, then shut it down and locked up the shop. Tomorrow, a husband would see his wife's face light up when she saw her father's car restored to glory. Mrs. Chen would drive her Honda, knowing she'd been charged fairly for honest work. 17 families would start the new year with money in their pockets that fraud would have stolen. And Marcus would come to work at a place where doing right wasn't just expected, it was the foundation everything else was built on. As he drove through the city toward his grandmother's house, toward tamales and family, and the kind of celebration that didn't need fraud to fund it, Marcus thought about the long journey that had brought him here. The fear, the isolation, the weight of doing what was right when everything inside him wanted to stay safe and silent. But his grandmother had been right all along. When you find your calling, you hold on to it with both hands. Not just the technical skills, not just the professional success, but the deeper calling, the responsibility to leave things better than you found them, to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, to choose integrity even when integrity came with a price. The radio played softly as he drove, holiday music mixing with the hum of his engine. Somewhere in the city, Frank Morrison was spending his first Christmas in prison, paying the price for years of choosing profit over people. Somewhere else, families were gathering around tables paid for with honest work, their celebrations unmarked by the weight of stolen money. And in a small house above a bakery, an old woman who had spent her life teaching the value of hard work and honesty was setting an extra place at her table, waiting for a grandson who had finally learned what those lessons really meant. Marcus parked outside his grandmother's house and sat for a moment, looking up at the warm yellow light spilling from her windows. Inside, he could hear laughter, children's voices, the clatter of plates being set on a table. Family, trust, love built on truth. He climbed the stairs to her door, carrying with him the hard-won knowledge that doing right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. That standing up for others meant sometimes standing alone, but that eventually, if you held fast to your principles, you found your way to people who shared them. The door opened before he could knock, his grandmother's arms already reaching for him, her face bright with joy and pride, and the unshakable love that had guided him through his darkest moment and brought him safely home. "Mijo," she whispered, pulling him close. "Welcome home." And for the first time in months, Marcus felt like he truly was.